Thank you, everyone, for showing up. A myth, in essence, is a cosmic story, meaning it's a story that paints not just characters and drama, but it colors the entire world, the entire cosmos. A really good myth will answer three questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? And where are we going? There are different levels of these cosmic stories. You begin with the whole universe, or at least the universe experienced by a people. So to map it, you would have to map the heavens and the hells, the world of mundane life that we live in here. And the story will also involve the most powerful beings in that universe, the defining characters, the paradigms. Examples would be Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, as we'll soon discuss, Arjuna in India, Confucius, Plato, Lao Tzu, Chuang-Tzu, so on and so forth. And these are people who either explain reality as a whole or they participate in that reality in a way that all people should look at them as an ideal person and perhaps a person to emulate. In the West, we know the characters Adam, the first man, Moses, the lawbringer, David, the king, prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, so on and so forth. And in Christendom, this culminates with Jesus and his apostles. The three layers I want to point out here, you've got the cosmic story. Where does the world come from? Where are we now in it? Where is the world going? Below that, though, you have the civilizational story. Who are we as a people? Where did we come from? Where are we going? And with each person within that civilization, each person is going to have that question answered. There are different ways of looking at myths. Some think of myth as just a fiction, a made-up story. The Marxist or atheistic, secular culture that we live in tends to dismiss these stories as nothing but, as just stories. I don't see it that way at all. Part of it is because I'm biased, because I've spent so much time in and among religious people and religious places, buried in these texts. But also, I do believe that just like a really good piece of fiction should inspire a person to be more realized, to be more whole, so the great cosmic and civilizational stories do the same on a collective level. Stories that everyone can share. Before we get into the real meat of what I want to convey to you, which is one of the central stories of India, the Mahabharata, and a small section of that story, the Bhagavad Gita, I just want to lay out familiar stories from the West that hopefully will spark a lot of memories, hopefully a lot of good memories, and give us something to compare these Indian stories to. And also, just to get a sense of who I'm talking to, have any of you heard of or read or are familiar with the Mahabharata or the Bhagavad Gita? Just don't, well, that's only a few, so I'm going to keep it as basic as I possibly can while still hopefully conveying the real richness of the story. But in the West, you have two basic foundations building up to our modern culture. The one side you have Greece. The other side you have the Hebrew story that culminates in Christianity. It's oftentimes been said, on one pole you have Jerusalem, and on the other you have Athens. And the combination of those two make up Christianity, and the evolution of Christianity is what produced modern secular philosophy, science, and even in some sense Marxism, which would seek to eradicate it and its origins, to cut the culture off at the root. You're probably familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey. And this is the deep structure of Greek culture conveyed by a probably mythical poet Homer, dated somewhere around the 12th or 13th centuries BCE or BC. So we're talking about over 3,000 years ago. And the story of heroes, of warriors, and honor culture. An honor culture in which the warriors seek to take vengeance on their enemies and to retrieve a woman. The story was passed down orally, generation after generation after generation. And I know some of you here are part of various organizations in which an oral tradition is extremely important, so that the story is not just externalized, but is internalized completely, and that oral tradition forces the person who is a part of it to embody, in some sense, that story. And of course, the aim of these Homeric tales, the aim of the story of Agamemnon leading the Greeks to retrieve Helen from Troy, it's meant to inspire men, inspire them to bravery, inspire them to loyalty, and of course to inspire them to commit horrific violence on other men with some sense of dignity and respect for the other side, but still a willingness to gut another man, spear him in the ground, and according to some interpretations, to ravish the dead body. Explaining, I guess, a lot of the later Greek motifs of man-on-man love. That story is the basis, I believe, of the early phases of what we call civilization. The story of men banding together to get bounties, to take revenge, to take territory. You see it in the Old Testament. You see it in the myths of China, Africa, Native Americans, so on and so forth. But in a few cultures, you have a kind of theoretical layer that gets built on top of it, a philosophical layer. So in the case of Greece, that would be the culmination of this honor culture, this warrior culture in Athens, in Sparta, and in the various philosophical schools that sprang up around the Mediterranean, so that they still are conveyed in story. Plato, for instance, is full of stories, but there's an analytical layer on top of it. And you'll see in India, this is extremely important. In India, there's this very unique fusion of that story, those questions. Who are we? Where have we come from? And where are we going? Not just in the tale with a beginning and an end, but a kind of eternal form or series of forms to which those stories adhere or conform. Across from Athens, you have Jerusalem. And I think that many people aren't as familiar with the Greek stories unless they've had the privilege of a classical education, but most people in America, most people in the West are very familiar with the Hebrew stories that culminate in the story of Jesus. They're very different from the Greek stories by and large, but there are certain similarities. One of the key differences in the Greek origin story of the cosmos, where did we come from? The commonly held theme of ancient Greek origin stories was a theme of battle between the Titans, who were the original high gods, and the Olympians. The Olympians, of course, being Zeus, Athena, Mars. And so in the beginning of the Greek story of where the universe came from, it is a battle. It's a battle and it's a conquest. So that by the time you arrive at the story of Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey, these are not all-powerful gods. These are gods that are very, very human in their personas, in their desires, in their pettiness, in their propensity for trickery and violence. In the Hebrew story, on the other hand, you have the one God, or the Elohim, a council of gods. But whether we interpret the Elohim as a sort of a way of saying one God, or some maybe primordial sense that there was a council of many gods, this is an all-powerful entity that simply effortlessly just speaks the cosmos into existence. So when God says, "Let there be light," and begins to build our world layer upon layer upon layer, it is simply through the effort of speech. And again, these stories, these ancient Hebrew stories, were passed down through oral tradition. In a sense, you could say that the ancient Hebrews spoke Genesis into existence continually, ritualistically, passing down then the story of Adam and Eve, the fall in the garden, in which the blame for the horrors of life, death, old age, the blame is put on human beings. Where do we come from? Who are we? We are fallen beings. And it's in some sense our fault, or at least the fault of primordial man. And while myself, I don't think a strict, literal interpretation of these Old Testament stories is appropriate, not to say that they're all entirely made up, but I do think they represent a compression of many, many, many different stories into one continual theme. You can see something like the scientific story of evolution and cultural evolution that most people take for granted now. So, in the beginning is the cosmos, and then you have the basic elements of the sky, the sea, the land, and into those are layered various animals and beings, and then humans sitting at the pinnacle, and then the unfolding of a tribal society through the book of Judges and so on and so forth, into a kingdom, the kingdom of David, of Saul, David, Samuel, and then the overtaking of that kingdom by empires. You had in the beginning, in Exodus, you have the escape of the Hebrews from an empire. In the empire, there's this theme of an overpowering and domineering and unfair, ungodly entity that the Hebrews are contending with. And that theme of the pagan gods and the domination against the will of God, of this people of God, continually, over and over again. You see once you get to, or past the kings, into first the north kingdom being destroyed by the Assyrians, and then the whole of Jerusalem being destroyed by the Babylonians, you get this sense in the story that God has chosen these people, but unlike the other civilizations around them in which, when they asked, why are we here? Why have we been destroyed? Typically the response would be, because the other gods are stronger. In the case of the Hebrews, it's something very unique. You have this introspection, and they refused in their stories to admit that these foreign gods were more powerful, and that's why they had been defeated. They insisted that God did it on purpose, that their God, Yahweh, the Elohim, that their God was simply punishing them. Again, it's this introspection, this questioning of not only the larger social structure, but also questioning one's own culture. It's something that's very, very unique in history. You only see it really in early civilization 4 times. In what's known as the axial age, you see this process unfold in the philosophical schools of Greece, in which culture is relativized, power is relativized, fairness and the sense of an anchored permanent law or permanent morality is held aloft. And then you have the same in the prophetic movement of the Hebrews. You have something very similar in the Zoroastrians of Persia. You have something very similar among the Hindus and the Buddhists and the Jains of India. And you have something very similar in China with Confucius, with Lao Tzu, with the Mohists, and so forth. This is known as the axial age. Are you familiar with this term, just really quickly?
No.
So this was coined really by Karl Jaspers, a German philosopher, 1948, the end of the Second World War. And he, like many Germans, was trying to reckon with the horrific violence and social control of Nazism, of communism, even the excesses of liberal democracy, say in the bombing of Dresden, the nuclear assault on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he was looking for some sort of constant moral structure across civilizations that could give an answer to the problem of tribal identity and tribal and national struggle. And what he identified, building on the work of others, the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead had a very similar sort of outlook, but not as systematic. What he found was that in those cultures I just mentioned, basically between the years 200 and 800 BC, that there arose the philosophers in Greece and the flowering of the school of Athens with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, that you saw something very similar, again, this relativism and the sense of the culture being relative, but the morality and the anchor of reality being absolute. You found the same among the Hebrews, and particularly their prophets, among the priests of Iran, descending from Zoroaster, among the ascetics or the renunciates of India, and then the sages of China. So again, Confucius, Mozi, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi. And it's almost like some sort of alien civilization began beaming the earth with some consciousness elevating energy. Because it's before that you only have, for the most part, tribal cultures and then god-king cultures. God-king cultures in which the gods are basically identified with the ruler of the state. And suddenly you had this questioning of the state. You had this questioning of everything. And if you're familiar with Plato in particular, all of his dialogues are just continual questioning. there's never an answer given, not really. The creation stories, for instance, in Plato, they don't make sense together and they're not necessarily intended to. If you look at the Timaeus, you just simply have the eternal forms, this divine design, and then God is a craftsman, a demiurge, that is trying his best to create what is in those eternal forms and is obviously beautiful. You look around, it's clearly beautiful, but it's flawed. It dies. Everything gets sick. You have very similar ways of thinking in India, very similar ways of thinking in China in this axial age, that period leading up to one of the major historical events of history, Jesus. You have this kind of premonition or foreshadowing of this one sort of divine reality of which what we see is nothing but a sort of pale imitation. But back to the stories. I mean, if you're familiar with the Hebrew story, you know that after the northern and southern kingdom are destroyed by empires, the Jews are taken captive in Persia by a Zoroastrian emperor. It would appear that some of those stories had a deep impression on the writing of the Hebrew Bible. And then they were released by King Cyrus to rebuild the temple in the Levant. That, of course, leads up to the story we all know with Jesus. And that story in particular is like one of the essential paradigmatic stories. You have a birth narrative, something like a growth narrative. You have struggle, personal struggle in the desert, for instance, against Satan in temptation. You have the struggle against the powers of the civilization, the powers of the Jewish king, the power of the Pharisees, the power of Roman authorities, culminating then in a crucifixion which becomes an image for the civilization that we now live in. And that image is completely counterintuitive to what anyone at that time or any time would expect from a king, right? Christ is called a king of kings, but he's the loser of the battle. Something completely counterintuitive. There are other similar stories, Dionysus, for instance, or you have stories in which in the Egyptian myths of Osiris, the dying and rising God. But in general, the story of Christ is the story of giving up worldly power, of losing to worldly power, and yet overwhelming. Now, there's something very similar that happens in India. So if you think of Jesus as a continuation of that story of the Hebrews, a story in which the loser is still the winner because the loser has the blessing of God, and the winners are in fact against God on this plane, but the true winner is the winner in another realm. You have something very similar that unfolds in India. And I want to, the real point of this talk is to hopefully convey to you the importance of the myth of the Mahabharata, but especially the Bhagavad Gita, which is the ultimate revelation of God to the people of India, at least of the Hindu persuasion. But I want to give you kind of a background of the cosmic view, like where they believed the world came from, where they thought they were, and where they thought they were going. Before the axial age, before 800 AD, most of the Indian high culture for which we have records of is the Vedic culture. You're familiar with the Vedas, very long collection of poems and hymns. A lot of creation stories. There's many, many different creation stories. One, for instance, in which all of reality emerges from a golden egg that is floating in a cosmic sea. And so that the world begins to evolve out of this primordial oneness, evolving of its own accord. Very different from the Jewish story of God speaking to matter and bringing existence into being. But this is paired with another story, and there's one hymn in particular where they talk about this difference. Another in which a craftsman, not unlike the demiurge from Plato, a craftsman simply sculpts the world into existence. And another in which the beginning of the universe is the divine sacrifice of a primordial human, the Purusha. And the writer of one of these particular Vedas notes, this is very puzzling, like some say this, some say that, and ultimately concludes there's really no way we can ever know. But they still, these Hindu seers, these rishis, the composers of these Vedas, which are something like, you could say it's something like the Old Testament of India. These seers were very comfortable with that ambiguity. They didn't need a rational, step-by-step, logical progression. Maybe part of it was they were high. The Vedas are full of these stories of soma, some plant. Nobody really knows exactly what it was. Some plant that would inspire visions, that would inspire warriors to go into battle bravely, would take one to the gods. The high god of the Vedas, the storm god Indra, which is very much like the storm god Yahweh in the Old Testament, was always munching on this stuff. He couldn't get enough of it. And it's perhaps due to that kind of meditative psychedelic culture that India developed in its pathway uniquely as opposed to, say, the more hard-scrabbled Hebrews or the refined Athenians. But the Vedas form the background, but it's really like the core of Hindu civilization is at least in my opinion, the philosophical Hindu civilization is what grew out of these Vedas. These Vedas in which the emphasis was on sacrifice and on warfare. The emphasis was especially on the fire sacrifice, in which various goods were burned and sent to the gods for good karma, which would allow a king or a ruler, basically, imagine there was a circle of wizards that were building up the karma and the power, the worldly power of the king that could lift him up to heaven. And that was the way in which a king could get his immortality. But you can see a progression in the speculation. Well, what if that energy runs out? And that was the conclusion, that one could perhaps storm the gates of heaven in that sense, but eventually the energy would wear off, basically, and they would descend back to earth. There had to be some other way. And you see these new stories forming in the Upanishads. The terms aren't as important as the concept. The Upanishads are sort of like what Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are to the Homeric myths. Socrates, assuming he was real, Plato and Aristotle built off of the Homeric story, but they built this idea of a formal world. In a very similar way, you had in India these people who would kind of drop out of society, these sannyasin, renunciates, and they would give up any claim they had to worldly power, worldly wealth, and they pursued meditative practices, and they completely rethought what the Vedas had taught them. This is oftentimes called the Vedanta. Vedanta basically meaning after the Vedas. And the Buddha would be an heir to this. So Buddhism, as an offshoot of Hinduism, is in essence a kind of Vedanta, but it completely discards it. We'll get to that in just one moment, but as long as we have the map here, pretty much all of this is occurring along the Ganges. And Hindu culture spread out from there, but the real centers of cultural and intellectual life were in and around cities like Varanasi or Benares, as it's oftentimes called, what's now Delhi, and of course the Himalayas, right? A lot of these sannyasin, a lot of these ascetics, these monks would disappear off into the Himalayas, and there's all these stories, of course, of the wise man on the mountain that had been able to see what reality is beyond just the day-to-day mundane life of slaves, work, toil, kings, war, and even the priests who are casting these spells. So I'll give you the quick and dirty of kind of like the world of the Hindu, the world of the Vedanta, which begins with the Vedas. And you had, like I say, in one of the main stories, this idea of the Purusha, a person. And you'll also notice that Purusha and person sound somewhat similar, and that's no coincidence. The Indo-European languages coming down from the steppes east or west of Russia, the Indo-European language is shared all across this whole region. So not only are there a lot of similar words, but you have similar gods. Again, the storm god Indra, very much like the storm god Yahweh, very much like the storm god Zeus, whose main weapon was a lightning bolt. And in this paradigmatic creation story, this Purusha, this person, is everything. It's all. And somehow, without getting too hung up on the illogic of it, these beings show up to sacrifice this person. So at the very beginning of the Hindu story, or at least this branch, is a human sacrifice in which this person is killed, his body burned, and from the ashes, his skull becomes the sky, his eye becomes the sun, if I recall correctly, a piece of his brain becomes the moon, and all of these other elements that we see in the world are formed from this human sacrifice, this primordial human sacrifice. But then the humans are formed from different parts of his body. So that the caste system, you're probably all familiar with the Hindu caste system in India, this very rigid hierarchy with the priests at the top and the warrior kings below and the merchants below and the servants below and the untouchables completely outside of it. In this story, nobody knows how ancient, probably more ancient than the Homeric myths. The Brahmin come from the mouth. The Brahmin, the priest, is the one who tells the story, who speaks reality into existence. And they believe this so much that in some Hindu schools, they believe that if the Brahmins ceased to chant, the sun would cease to rise. And in some Hindu schools, they believe that the Vedas are so important, these Vedas that are also, like the Homeric myths, being passed down word of mouth, that they actually form the structure of reality itself. Kind of like mathematics and physics, the Vedas are this underlying structure to reality. The Hebrews had a very similar belief. The Hebrews believed that the Torah was eternal and that the Torah was this sort of linguistic structure of the world. So the Brahmins come from the mouth, the Kshatriya come from the arms, right? The warrior, the enforcer. The Vaishya, the merchants, the farmers, the productive class, come from the thighs and the balls, the loins. They're the productive energy of society. And of course, the Shudra are the feet. And so even as they saw the whole cosmos as this primordial human sacrifice, they also saw all of society as one organism in which you had the head, the arms, the heart, the legs and balls, and all of it resting on the servants. Plato had very similar beliefs. He saw it as a threefold structure, but very, very similar. Plato believed at the top should be the philosopher king, where he suggested it in his dialogue. In the middle should be the productive class, and at the bottom, the slaves. And Plato shared a lot of other beliefs in common with the Hindus. One imagines, even with this great distance, perhaps there was some communication. Just for instance, Plato at the end of the Republic speaks of reincarnation. And of course, the Hindus are famous for their concept of reincarnation. The very last story of Plato's Republic is the story of a warrior who's killed in battle and wakes up on the funeral pyre. They ask him where he'd been, what he'd seen, and he described souls descending from heaven and being reborn, or ascending from hell to be reborn, or people dying and going into the same. These are, again, cosmic stories that, just like our heaven and hell, these give meaning to one's life. How did, at the end of the Republic, how did one go to heaven? Good deeds. How did one go to hell? Bad deeds. In the Hindu conception, you're very familiar with the idea of karma, the same idea. What originally in the ancient Vedas was simply ritual came to be seen as moral code. If one's moral code was proper, then one would ascend to the heavens. And if one's moral code was evil, or at least flawed, one would descend to the hells. But once one's karma was burned off in the hells or burned off in the heavens, inevitably one would be reborn. And this idea they called samsara, this cycle, an endless cycle of death and rebirth, all driven by karma, both good karma and bad karma. One more element I want to bring up before I ask a question of you, and then get into really the meat of the talk. In the fully developed Hindu worldview, you had this concept of the all beyond, of the one, and also the one within. So that these forest dwellers and mountain dwellers, as they speculated or as they told it, experienced the true ground of reality, as they looked out at all the phenomenon and the phenomena around them, they saw beyond it, tying it all together, a oneness, the Brahman, the fire that's within the sun, the fire that's within the wood, the fire that's within the earth, the water, so on and so forth, the one. It mirrors, in some sense, the one God of the Hebrews, of the Christians, and of course of Plato himself. And there was another group of seers who saw something very similar within as they meditated, perhaps as they ate the soma, and they looked inward. They saw that what was inside was eternal, that the body was a sheath, and that thing that is experiencing inside the body, the Atman, the self, the breath, that thing would pass on and on from life to life. And then at the full fruition of this was the notion that, okay, well, if I look into you or into anything and see that there is a one inside of it, and I know there is a one inside of me, then that must mean that the one beyond is also the one the one within. That the same God that animates each person is the God that animates the whole universe, a sort of pantheism that God is experiencing through all of us. Not that they didn't still hold to gods, though. They did. They believed in all sorts of gods. Famously, India is the land of 300 million gods. But in the higher philosophical schools, they believe that all of these gods are mere faces for the one God, for the Brahman. And the three classic faces were the creator, Brahma. You've probably seen his statues. He's got 4 heads, 4 arms. He fades into the background because after the creation, there's really not much for him to do. And then you have Vishnu, the sustainer, the God that, or the face of God that holds all of this together. One of the highest and most revered gods in India, because it's really the only one with anything to do at the moment. And then, of course, the destroyer. As all of this comes to a close, the face of God that will become dominant is Shiva, the destroyer. And all of this they believed, again, in the same sense that all time and all life is a cycle, and a cycle of rebirths. They also believed that history was a cycle, so that in the beginning of creation, you would have a golden age, and God would basically dream all of this into being. The God within us and the God without would dream all of this into being, and it would be mostly perfect. And that golden age would descend into a silver age, which was pretty good, but not perfect. And then descend into a bronze age, which was getting pretty crummy. And then into what Hindus, by and large, believe we're in today, the Iron Age, the age of Kali, the age of death, the end of the cycle, in which the honor of the priest would be in question, the power of the king would be subverted, and ultimately the interest of the slave and the rule of the slave would be the norm. All right, so this is just, I felt it necessary to give you a kind of sense of what that world is that they're living in India. And I hope that the review of Homer and just to think of the stories of the Old Testament, the story of the New Testament, stories, would hopefully give you at least some sense of what the story is of your life. And perhaps you don't believe in any of that. Perhaps, like many, maybe most people in the modern world, you believe something more in line with the scientific, so that there is no need for gods. Nature is sufficient unto herself. And the true story, the true cosmic story, is one of a Big Bang and the consolidation of galaxies and planets, the evolution of life, the cultural evolution that led us to here, including the false stories of religion, leaving us as kind of hopeless and helpless meatbags with nothing much to hope for than to perhaps create a data center big enough to upload our souls into. But whatever story you hold, I just want to pause here for just maybe 5-10 minutes. And if you would just write down, even if it's just a word or a paragraph, what is the story that your personal story is embedded within? And if it's multiple stories, like my own, then just 3 of them, 2 of them, whatever it is. Don't wear yourself out with it. But think your life, your story from your birth and your family, your community that you were raised in, the direction that you believe your life is going, and especially the meaning of that life. What is that story? Is it a Christian story? Is it a philosophical story? Is it, as in our now degraded age is so common, a political story and a political meaning? Or are you going to be uploaded? But just, if you'll just take 5 minutes, and anybody who wants to talk about it when this whole thing is over with, I would actually like to hear it. I would like to know. It doesn't have to be on the camera, but I would like to know, like, what is the story, the background story in which your own personal, individual life is unfolding. So just 5 minutes, and I'll leave you alone. I'll leave you to it. All right. 101 is always the hardest part. You never know what people already know. Laying that foundation is a daunting task. I remember the first religious studies class I ever taught, I wrote down phenomenology, cosmology, epistemology, ontology, axiology, began breaking it all down, and these kids looked at me like, what the fuck is wrong with you? I never made that mistake again. But the main myth of India, first things first, why would you even care? What is this Pajit mysticism? And why does it even matter? For me, it was my path back to Christianity. I'd become pretty disillusioned, especially with the kind of fundamentalist Southern Baptist approach to Christianity, which I found to be very thin. And somehow through reading some of the introductory texts, like Houston Smith or Joseph Campbell, and then people like Mircea Eliade, it brought me back. I realized that the Hindus, whatever problems modern India has, that the Hindus had arrived at something very beautiful, very comprehensive, and that reflected in many ways the Western tradition that I was starving for, and it led me back in. So personally, that was why I found the Hindu myths to be so important. On a civilizational level, though, you have two different things that have happened. With colonialism, and as more and more scholars began pulling these texts, these Sanskrit texts, out of India and translating them and comparing them and doing that side by side with Western texts, doing that side by side with Chinese texts, they found this whole world of beauty that wasn't particularly obvious from the kind of demoralized and degraded culture that the early British and other European colonists found in India. And then by the time you get to the 60s, in America and in Europe, Britain especially, you had this influx of Hindu gurus and this explosion of kind of Hindu and Indian fetishism. Much of the 60s aesthetic comes out of India. Like if you go to India today, you'll see paisley on everything, and you'll see the incense and so on and so forth. Like you'll see that much of what we now take for granted as hippie culture is an extension of Indian culture into our own. And it had a profound impact. It's been cheapened. It's, I think, really cheapened by American pop culture, but it still has a major impact. Maybe not least of which is the kind of tolerance and acceptance of other belief systems. India is notoriously tolerant. It's the mother of three major religious traditions and all of these different sub-traditions within. So building from just that world of the early Vedic culture and the Purusha and the caste system, so on and so forth, you had Hinduism, in which the caste system is preserved, priest at the top, king below that, productive class below that, merchant class, and the servant class at the bottom, and the outcasts on the outside. But you really have the elevation of the sannyasin, the sannyasi, the renunciates, the people who went out into the forest to meditate, the people who went up to the mountain to meditate. And it's from that culture, from that renunciate culture, the wandering mendicant, the person who has renounced violence, who has renounced physical power and status, has renounced sex and marriage, and has dedicated himself solely to the pursuit of unity with ultimate reality, unity with God. It's from that you get the Jain culture, if you're familiar with it. It's much smaller insofar as the number of adherents in India, but still quite prominent. And Jains are an extension of the Hindu ideal of going beyond this cycle of birth and death and rebirth and death and rebirth and death to achieve liberation, to achieve moksha, to achieve unity with that ultimate reality that sits behind the illusion of this dying, decaying world that we now inhabit. And the person who founded it whether he's real or not, Mahavira, the name Mahavira means great warrior. So it's an irony built into it. This great warrior wasn't making war for conquest, wasn't making war to save Helen from Troy, or making war to drive out the Canaanites, or making war on the Jewish state as the Romans did. The Mahavira was making war on the lowest parts of the self, so that urge for violence and conquering and domination was turned inward to free that inner self, that Atman, or Jiva, as the Jains called it. And the Buddha was also an heir to the Hindu culture. People talk about Buddhism as if it's atheistic, in a sense, sort of. But the Buddha himself, if you look at the ancient Buddhist stories, it's taken for granted that the gods exist. It's taken for granted that there are heavens and hells, that a no-self, in the case of the Buddhists, is descending into and going up to and descending into endlessly until you can get off that path. The Buddha's path, famously, was a middle way. It was between the excesses of hedonism and the excesses of asceticism that the Hindus were performing, in which one would mortify oneself. You can see it even today in India now. There are men who will live their whole life with their arm in the air, or men who mutilate their bodies or starve themselves. Buddhism is an extension of that renouncer culture, the sannyasin, but without the extremity of self-mortification. Yeah.
Could you tell me what the definition of mortification?
Just damaging oneself, or denying oneself to an extreme, so you've literally starved yourself into a walking skeleton.
And the purpose is?
So this comes out of, and please, any questions like that, you especially, brother, any questions like that, definitely. So this renunciate culture is kind of evolving out of the Vedic priest culture. And you have these people that are going out into the forests and dedicating their life to, again, they're trying to get to that ultimate reality. They're trying to get to that Brahman, or they're trying to realize that Atman inside themselves. And the obstacle is desire, is the human form, the human flesh, hunger, the feeding, fighting, fucking. These are like the real barriers to true enlightenment in Hinduism. And the Buddha picks that up, but just gives it a somewhat different slant. The Buddha simply means awake, and the Buddhists rejected the Vedas and the Vedic sacrifices, even if they still believed that the gods existed, but they did not believe those gods were the highest being. The Buddhists believed that nirvana, the total escape, the blowing out of the candle. Nirvana means to blow out the candle, and it's the candle of desire. And for the Buddha, it's not that different from Hinduism, but think of it more as an elaboration on Hinduism. The Buddha was born a king. He renounced, or a prince, and he renounced his heir to the throne, his inheritance, in order to pursue meditation with a Hindu, meditation with a Jain. He achieved the highest realization of the oneness with reality with the Hindu. And he achieved total control over his hungers with the Jain. But he realized that wasn't enough. What one had to do, both of those represented still a desire. It went from feeding, fighting, and fucking to freedom. And what he believed, or what he discovered, was that one had to even give up the longing for freedom. One had to completely eliminate desire, to blow out that candle. And once that candle, that flame that burned for something out there, had been extinguished, then one achieves enlightenment, one achieves nirvana, the blowing out of the candle, and one is no longer reborn into this eternal endless cycle.
So that's the satisfaction of the karmic loop and the exit from it?
Yes. And it's not satisfaction, it's the elimination of. That's the important part. It's a good point. So it's not as if once you get to this renunciate culture, Buddhism, the Hindu mystics, the Jain mystics, it's not a satisfaction of karma, because the karma, whether it's good or bad karma, is what's keeping you in this cycle. It's the elimination of karma, the negation of karma, that they believed was the true freedom. It's not dissimilar to the monks, the extreme monks in Christianity, St. Anthony in the desert, for instance. But today's monks, with the monasteries developing centuries after Buddhism, are much more like the Buddhists in that they're not starving themselves to death. They created these communities, the Sanghas, in which they pursued the Buddhist path. And the Sangha just means community of monks. And they pursued the Buddhist path, the Dharma. And they saw it as a wheel, a technological metaphor, as it were. And what was also really important about the Buddha, as long as we're on that, the development of these communities, they accepted people from any caste. So for the Hindu, they saw reincarnation beginning in the lowest of beings, plants and animals and so on and so forth. And one would move up through the servants and the merchants and the kings and the priests and so on and so forth until one emerged out the top through successive incarnations. And you might wonder, well, where are the women in all this? In the kitchen. And this was this path upward that was only open really ultimately to the highest born people. The Buddhists believed that someone from any of the castes, including the outcasts, including women, could join them, and they would renounce the desire for power, they would renounce the desire for profit and privilege, and would achieve enlightenment outside the system. The Buddha, of course, his existence is in the shadow of the Himalayas here on the Ganges, roughly 400 BC. And
yeah, going back to the realization of Buddhism to eliminate even the desire for enlightenment and to achieve nirvana. It's always something that's been confusing to me, because that to its ultimate form would mean that you sit and do nothing ever, and you just wither away and die. And so I'm curious if there's anything that you've found that offers drive once you've discovered that. What drives you past that point when you've eliminated all desire? Do they have an explanation?
So it's the attachment that's the problem. And so in a Buddhist context, and of course Buddhism, there's so many different forms, so many different versions, all variations on the same theme. But the idea is that once one has attained true enlightenment, one can kind of continue on in their life as a monk. They don't just disappear and die. They will kind of flicker out into nirvana. But it's not necessarily nothingness. So, for instance, in one of the Buddhist texts, the Buddha is asked, when you die, he's getting close to death, and they ask him, when you die, where will you go? What is nirvana? What is this place? And he said, it is neither existence nor non-existence, nor is it not existence, nor is it not existence. It's it's just something else. Another time he was asked, and he just produced a flower, kind of a jerk or a smart ass.
I've heard a great answer to that question of, it was on a show actually, and it was described really well. It was like when the wave crashes in the ocean, a droplet rises up, and then once it's reached its peak, it just falls directly back into the ocean, joining back again with the source that it came from.
And you know, some Christian mystics would say very, very similar things. Jewish mystics, similar things. Yeah, there are like a lot of different versions of. There's no one thing about Hindu and Buddhist and just Indian religious culture. All of them basically believed that they were right and that their view was better than the other one. But they were very accepting of the existence of them, and they kind of embraced the arguments. With the exception of Buddhism, and I guess it brings me to kind of the connection to the Mahabharata, right? Because with these Buddhists, the Mahabharata was composed, most of the ancient stories probably go back as early as the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? So most of the ancient stories probably go back many thousands of years. So 3,000 years probably-ish. Maybe 4, who knows? Maybe they grew up with the Vedas. Nobody really knows because all of it is being passed down word of mouth till very, very late when it's starting to be written down in Sanskrit. And just incidentally on that, people talk about all the time, like with the Bible, oh, it's the telephone game, people are just telling the story and it's getting exaggerated, it's getting changed around. Yes, but India provided this laboratory that's really interesting. The Vedas and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the other great epic of India, as they were beginning to be written down, they found variations for sure, but there weren't nearly as many as you would think. It kind of proved that strictly oral transmission of culture has really high fidelity in a very disciplined culture. So this idea, this Buddhist idea is, the Buddhists really took hold very, very fast. So that some 200 years after the Buddha began preaching and converting people to Buddhism and bringing them into the monastery and out of the society into these subcultures, you had King Ashoka, who's kind of like the Constantine of Buddhism. And he began to spread Buddhism basically by force across India, but with this gentleness, right? This demand that people no longer eat animals, for instance, that his conversion to Buddhism came, according to legend, after a mass slaughter of his enemies and this horrible guilt at having killed all of these men. And so he then instituted a kind of pacifism upon, of course, penalty of death with soldiers, but it's still,
Pacifism under penalty of death.
Yeah, same with the Jains. The Jains, notorious warriors, and they
Influence or power?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, you could say it would be like, they talk about the woke and the libs now, kind of like that, but with much better art and deeper philosophy.
I remember a guy in college got in an argument with an anti-war activist once about how important it was to not use violence to solve problems. And the argument ended with the nonviolent activist punching him in the face.
Yeah.
And he was a martial artist that could have destroyed the guy, and he walked away peacefully and just didn't hit him back. It's kind of funny.
He would have been a supreme Buddhist. Ashoka would have been ashamed, but you have these people that are like dropping out en masse, and the Hindus began to drive the Buddhists out. By the time you get to the era when the Mahabharata is really, really taken hold, so that being around 200 BC into around the time of Christ, nobody's really sure because the Hindus, for all their brilliance, were not big on keeping detailed histories, or at least not chronologically. They just kind of told the stories over and over again. Nobody really knew, but you had this massive push. It seems that there was like an ethnic cleansing of Buddhists. And one of the reasons, most likely, was because all of these people were pursuing the Buddha's dharma, the Buddha's path, the Buddha's wheel of enlightenment, rather than the Hindu dharma. In Sanskrit, in the Hindu tradition, dharma is extremely important. Dharma means a lot of different things, just like a lot of words will mean many things. Dharma means law, as in the law of the land. Dharma means law as in the law of the cosmos, the universe. Dharma means the structure of the universe. And maybe most importantly, dharma means duty, as in if you are a Brahmin priest and you are born into your Brahmin caste, you must pursue the dharma of your caste, the duty of your caste. You must do the rituals. You must keep doing the chants. You got to make the sun rise and fall. And if you're a king, you have to protect your people and you have to fight. And if you're a Vaishya, you have to, sell stuff. And if you're a servant, you have to serve and be a slave. And that is your dharma, that is your duty. But for the Buddhists, same word, but the dharma is focused outside of this caste system. Yes, sir.
Why do most of the words on there end with an A? Is it like some kind of ongoing theme?
Yeah, the Hindus, or the, Sanskrit is kind of sing-songy like that. A lot of A's, a lot of I's. I don't know.
There's probably a meaning in one.
I also have another question about
Okay.
I don't know if you went over this or not, but the thing under sun kind of looks like the backwards Nazi symbol with dots on it. Like,
Yes,
did the Nazis copy that?
they did actually. So you'll notice it like in India, as you walk around India, I've oftentimes joked, it looks like Nazis crashed a UFO into the Ganges and came out and dominated everyone and put their swastikas everywhere. When you walk around India, there are swastikas everywhere. And some of them are this way, some of them are like the Nazi symbol, and it just means the sun. It's a sign of luck, it's a sign of power, and it goes back millennia, right? And you find it all over the world actually, but what the Nazis did is they took, Hitler sent...
Oh, they took that, turned it backwards, and made it their type of...
Yes.
Saying we're the power.
Yes, and the idea, the Aryan ideal of the Nazis, right? That also is taken from the Indians, because the Indians had this concept of Arya. Arya just means noble, and Aryan is a blood nobility, right? This is a digression from the Mahabharata, but it's a great one. Aryans, as best as linguists or philologists, as best as geneticists, as best as archaeologists have been able to tell, the Aryans came down from the Russian steppes, or the steppes above the Caucasus Mountains here. And this would have been 4,000, 5,000 years ago, anybody's guess. And these were people with blonde hair and blue eyes-ish, mostly. And they began to pour down into what's now Iran, and Iran takes its linguistic root from Aryan. It simply just means noble, the noble people. And these are the people of the Vedas, right? These are the warrior tribes. And they at some point had really refined the chariot. So the two-wheeled chariot with a driver and an archer became extremely important for their domination of their neighbors. And as they moved down into Iran, they dominated the peoples there and developed what would become Zoroastrianism. As they moved into India, they dominated the dark-skinned Dravidian people, so that in North India, even now, you can see among the Brahmin, they are much lighter-skinned, and as you go down into the lower castes, they're much darker-skinned. That doesn't hold true the further south you go, but it's a piece of evidence, right? And then you also have very good evidence linguistically, if not through genotype mapping, that in Greece, the same Indo-Europeans, the same Aryans, that culture spread. So the word aristocrat, which means noble, most likely has its root still in Aryan. And it may well be all the way out to Ireland, or Erin. In Irish or in Celtic, Ireland is Erin, or Iran, or Aryan. What Hitler did was basically, he was kind of like the first hippie, in a sense. Like, hippies, because hippies became obsessed with India and they wanted to imitate the Indians. And they're like, these guys are really brilliant, we need to do things more like them. And he became obsessed with Buddhists and Indians. And Indians' obsession with bloodline and the Arya and magical kind of pagan powers. And so hence the adoption of the swastika, hence the adoption of this Aryan ideal, this idea of blood and soil. But so long as we're on that.
Oh, so is that why he said that his race is like the master race?
That's why he said that, yeah.
Because he took all of the, that makes sense.
Yeah, kind of a chauvinist, that guy. As were as are the Brahmin, as are the whatever the heirs are in the UK, as are technically like the Sioux and the Comanche. It's kind of a typical tendency among especially warrior cultures to say my culture's the best, my bloodline should exist instead of yours, or at least dominate and enslave yours. Now, the Buddha, obviously a peacemaker, right? Now, it's really interesting how you can see the concept of Aryan, this concept of Aryan, which began with a bloodline, began as this, they wouldn't have called it race necessarily, but it was racial, right? Like it's a descent of blood. And the Buddha's ministry, the Buddha's preaching, the Buddha's Dharma, the essence of the Buddha's Dharma is what's called the Four Noble Truths. And that word, the reason we say noble, is because it's the Aryan truths in Sanskrit. But what the Buddha did, because remember, the Buddha accepted low-caste people or foreigners, the Buddha accepted women. What the Buddha did is take what was an inheritance of nobility through blood, right? Father and son, so on and so forth, rape and conquest of women, and elevated that to the level of spirit or culture, and said that the true nobles are not a race, that the true nobles are those who accept the Four Noble Truths. And those Four Noble Truths, as long as we're veering around, the first noble truth, and you'll recognize it from samsara, the first noble truth is that all is suffering, dukkha. The second noble truth is that suffering is caused by desire, or tanha. The desire for that which you may obtain, but you will lose. The desire for things you will never obtain. Always reaching for a horizon you'll never ever get. That's the cause of all suffering. Desire. The third noble truth, quite logically, like the physician that he oftentimes described himself as, is to eliminate suffering, you must eliminate desire. Blow out the candle of desire and craving. And the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path, which various things like right speech, right mentality or internal thought, right action, kindness, the 5 precepts, don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, don't take intoxicants, don't be a sexual pervert. So in essence, the Buddha did something very similar to what Christianity did, what Christ did. Because without a doubt, even though you begin to have that critique, that self-critique in the Hebrew tradition, it's very clear up to the end of the Hebrew Bible. In the Hebrew arrangement, one of the last motifs of the Hebrew Bible is a commandment. Remember, again, I don't want to get too far afield, but the Persian king Cyrus has released them to go rebuild the temple in Israel. And so they had to come back and kind of retake over the land that they had been pulled out of. And so these people, these half-breeds, as they saw them, the Samaritans or the people of the land, had to be cleared away, and they had to keep the Hebrew bloodline pure. And so one of the last passages in the Hebrew Bible, as it's arranged in the Tanakh, or the Hebrew form, is a commandment never to breed with the people of the land, so that if one is caught, if they're caught in the act breeding or mating with the people of the land, a spear should be driven through them both. You know? So there's this, and so there's a sense of bloodline being very, very, very important. Whereas Jesus, the blood is this thing that is now ephemeral. It's something beyond the physical. And so the covenant that the Jews had with God, with Yahweh or the Elohim, is now expanded out of the Hebrew bloodline to the Greeks. And as it moves out, it begins to blend with the Greeks and their ideas, so that when you get the later church, it's literally just a combination of Hebrew scripture, Hebrew law, Hebrew morality, and logic and history with Greek philosophy and Greek culture. So the Buddha did something the same. And just as long as we're on it, and I'll get back to the Mahabharata, it's very interesting because you have two really dominant religious traditions that are centered on personalities, charismatic personalities. The first emerges roughly 400 BC in India in the shadow of the Himalaya. it spreads across India all the way down to the island of Sri Lanka and is driven out, but it begins to flourish by the time you get to the time of Christ. You have Buddhism is now spreading into China, and Buddhism is now one of the most, if not the most dominant religious traditions in Asia. And so you have the Buddha, the wheel of the Dharma, spinning out into Mongolia, into Siberia, all the way down into Indonesia, and it goes east, and this is a bloodline religion that is now made spiritual and is open to any bloodline. Hence, most of the Buddhas you see look Asian, but Buddha would have looked much more Indian, right? Or would have been Indian. A similar thing happened with Christianity some 400 years later, so that from this tiny little kingdom on the east of the Mediterranean, this personality spread the gospel or the spirit or the story of the Jews in Christian form through Europe, North Africa, and eventually all over the world. So it's an interesting thing. But why is the sky blue?
Refraction of light.
Boom. All right. What were we going to ask?
I was gonna say, while you're right there, go to have my pen back.
Dude, I gotta pay extra for this.
I do think it's interesting that you said with the Buddha, the distinction that he's so often depicted as Asian, but he was likely more Indian. I think about that a lot with Jesus as well, as how our culture has depicted him as a white man, very roughly fair-skinned, and
Yeah.
he was very likely much more dark.
Aryan.
Yeah.
He was, because of the geography of where he lived, I would imagine that he was more...
The Nazis had an Aryan Jesus. There's this whole alternate version of Jesus that the Nazis tried to push through the Lutheran Church, in which Jesus was like literally an Aryan, and that was why the Jews wanted to kill him, or something of that effect. To that effect. It's also interesting, though. You go to a black church, a lot of times black Jesus. In Asia, you go to a church in Asia, oftentimes, very often, Asian Jesus. India, maybe, I suppose. There's the Church of Annunciation in, I think, Bethlehem. And I remember I went there some years ago, and they have paintings and mosaics all around the courtyard. And this one's from Vietnam, this one's from Africa, or Ethiopia, this one's from here, this one's from there. And in all of them, Jesus and Mary and all of them are represented in the racial genotype of the place.
They project themselves onto it.
Yeah. And ultimately, if it is something beyond bloodline, it may not be historically accurate, but it may be in some sense more accurate because it represents that transcendence from above the blood. What time are we at, fellas?
4:12.
4:12. Getting close to. Well, all right. I'm gonna move on. Speed this along. I don't know how much you guys need to know about the Mahabharata, but I did.
There's a lot to know.
My first introduction was a man, James Fitzgerald, who was a very noted scholar of Sanskrit and Indian religion. And the first book that he recommended was this one, Ananda Kumaraswamy, and his telling of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, so on and so forth. When I was at Boston University, I had Harvard envy, like, every Boston University kid does. So I took some classes over at Harvard, and there was a woman, Ann Monius, and she recommended this one. It's a lot more in-depth and rich. It's this guy, William Buck. And William Buck died very, very young, I think of alcoholism. And Ann Monius said that, I was really surprised to hear this. She said that people who study Hindu scripture, the scholars, the deep scholars, tend to die very young. And a year later, she died. So, how about that? And then,
And you want to study the Mahabharata after that?
it's too late. I've already been taking. I'm not. These are Sanskrit scholars. I've got no. It's too late for me. My brain's too rotten to master Sanskrit. I learned a bit, but never mastered it. But J.B. Van
It's like some
Buitenen,
curse.
huh?
Maybe it's like some curse.
Maybe.
You dare read my secret
You're forbidden.
diary.
Dun dun dun. But J.B. Van Buitenen, he was really this. He was my advisor, James Fitzgerald. They partnered to do the what I think is probably the standard or the gold standard of the translation of the Mahabharata. This is book 1. The full Mahabharata is basically 15 times bigger than the Bible. Massive, massive, massive text, massive story. The Bhagavad Gita is sort of like, the Sermon on the Mount, which I consider to be the most important part of the Bible, aside from the crucifixion. The Sermon on the Mount is just this little sliver in the Bible. And the Bhagavad Gita is, in essence, a kind of similar thing. It's kind of like a Sermon on the Mount of the Mahabharata. Now, I'll give you the quick run on this. The Mahabharata begins, and many Hindu myths begin this way. The Ramayana begins similarly. It's not like it just drops down from the sky, like the Hebrew text. Or, even with the evangelists, you have like one evangelist, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and especially John, I saw this, this is what happened. It's very clear, this sense of progression. So for instance, Buck's rendition, he kind of narrows it down. You have this guy, Sadi, he comes across a friend. He's like, I just heard this story at a snake sacrifice that was being done by the priests and the king. What was it? It's the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata, the great king, or the great emperor, or also it also means India, right? The great land, the great kingdom. And then it turns out that he heard it from someone who's reciting the story that Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, wrote down. And the elephant-headed god wrote it down because a seer, unlike the seers of the Vedas, a seer kind of intuited psychically that this had occurred. His name was Vyasa. Not that it matters all that much, but and Vyasa wanted to recite it, and Ganesh said, he summons Ganesh, will you write it down? And Ganesh says, yes, but only on the condition that you do not stop speaking it as I write. The minute you stop speaking, I will stop writing. And he says, okay, but on the condition that if you have any questions about what's going on, like our friends here, then you have to stop if you have a question. And so he would oftentimes confuse Ganesh with the stories so he'd get a break and get a little breather. So the whole story itself is, again, it's not just dropped down. It's like there's a sense that it's being passed down word of mouth. And it begins, not unlike the Gospels or the early stories, the birth of Cain and Abel. It begins with birth, but it begins with these strange kind of immaculate conceptions. So there's all these bizarre scenarios. And one of them, you have one of these sannyasins, one of these renouncers, and he's meditating out by a river, and he becomes very excited, and his seed jumps into the water onto a leaf, and a fish eats the seed on the leaf, and a fisherman catches the fish and cuts it open, and the girl comes out, and the girl becomes the progenitor of some of the main characters, this sort of thing, right? And it's that Soma. And I got to say, too, I mean, to me, the Bible is the most precious text. But as far as metaphor and richness, you really can't compare the Bible to the Mahabharata and its elaborations. And the Mahabharata is a story of a war, a cataclysmic war that is going to usher in our degraded age, the Kali Yuga. And the war is fought between two branches of the same family, cousins in essence. On one side, you have the Pandavas under King Pandu, and the other, the Kauravas. You could say that the Pandavas are the good guys and the Kauravas are the bad guys, but they're very morally ambivalent. Like you're never really sure. Like there's all this scheming by the good guys, and the bad guys do a lot of good things for the other side. So, but ultimately the heroes are the Pandavas, and the Kauravas are the bad guys. the firstborn, like Moses, the firstborn becomes a bastard in a basket. The firstborn, Karna, from the Pandava family, is an immaculate conception. And here's how it happened. Pandu, the king of the good side, he's got his ladies. He's a king, right? So he's got two main squeezes. And he goes out hunting, as kings at the time were wont to do. And he comes upon these two deer, and the buck is just rooting it. And before the buck can finish, he shoots the buck. And the buck, as he's dying, curses him that since you killed me before I completed my pleasure, the next time you complete your pleasure, you'll die. So now the king of the good side has this curse that he can't copulate or he'll die. And his wife wants babies, as women tend to want. And so they consult one of the priests, or really more of a renouncer. And the renouncer gives her a magic formula by which she can call any god of her choosing to come and impregnate her. And the first god that she calls, just messing around, was the sun god, Surya. And she, because it's a god's baby, it's just like one day. The god comes and the next day, but now she's got this baby and she kind of freaks out. And so she puts him in a basket and sends him on down the road. He becomes one of the main warriors in the bad guy army, Karna, the incarnation of the sun. And then the next one, who is the true firstborn, right? The one who will inherit the kingdom, Yudhisthira, she calls down the god of Dharma. And remember the importance of Dharma. She calls down the god of law. The god of law is the god of kings. And what is the king's most important power? He has the dunda stick, the ability to say, you live and you die. And she calls Dharma down, boom, firstborn, Yudhisthira. Well, over across the way, the queen of the bad side, the Kauravas, is getting word about this, and she's been pregnant now for 2 years, and she doesn't know what's going on. And her husband is also born under a curse. Her husband's blind, but she's such a devoted wife that she lives blindfolded just so that she can be kind of crippled like him. But she's really freaking out. She's like, okay, now our children won't be firstborn. They won't inherit the kingdom. And in frustration, she aborts this 2-year-old fetus. And out comes this big lump of flesh. And one of these sannyasins, or the renunciates, or wizards.
Is this still Indian?
This is the Indian story, the Mahabharata, the great king, or the great kingdom.
So the great king.
And again, what does everybody want to be, right? Everybody wants to be the great king. And so being the firstborn is really important. And so this woman gives birth to this big ball of flesh, and they bring in the town wizards, basically. And they pour cold water onto it, or in other versions, they cut it up into 100 pieces, but there's actually one extra piece, so 101 pieces. And they take these bronze jars, and they fill them full of ghee, or butter. And they stick the pieces of flesh in each one of them. So these are basically like artificial wombs.
So it's just straight flesh?
Just little, it's said to be the size of a thumb.
Like not even like any blood or just
There's probably some blood. There's probably some,
straight flesh?
there's probably some blood. I'd say there's goo and stuff like that. So yeah, they put them in these jars to gestate. But they're behind, right? They're already screwed. They're already in trouble. They're not going to have a firstborn unless they can knock off Yudhisthira. And meanwhile, while these babies are gestating in these jars, the good queen, her name's Kunti, by the way, it doesn't really matter. The good queen continues to call the gods down. And so next she calls down the god of the storm, Indra, kind of Jehovah or Zeus-like god, and gives birth to Arjuna, who's like the kind of general. She calls down the god of wind or power and get Bhima, who's like this big bruiser. And then, so the king's other lady is getting a little jealous. And she's like, look, I I got to get some too, right? And so she gives her the spell, and she gives birth to twins, these kind of divine twins, medicine, agriculture, whatever, they're pretty broad-based. And boom, now you got 5 brothers, right? And the 5 brothers on the good side are, again, they're the incarnation of these gods, and yet it's kind of like in Christianity where Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and this human is still praying to a God that he is in the Orthodox theology. The same sort of thing is happening all throughout the Mahabharata. So Indra is still out there being Indra while Arjuna is down on earth being Indra's son, or Indra incarnate. And then you have Krishna, who we don't find out, but Krishna is also the incarnation of a god. And Krishna is a lowly charioteer. He's from the village way out. He becomes an ally, though. And remember how important it is for the Aryans, these chariots, right? And so the chariot driver is the guy that's he's basically the servant of the real warrior. And in the case of the Pandavas, it's Arjuna who's shooting all the arrows, right, in these wars. Krishna, incidentally, is said to be blue-skinned, dark-skinned. So there's this sense that not only is he a villager and, he's kind of low caste. And so kind of in the same sense of Jesus being a carpenter from Nazareth, you have this incarnation of a God that is outside of what the social structure is supposed to be. And they go on all these adventures, right? They get a wife, and they all marry one single wife. Draupadi is her name. Again, name isn't that important. But that's not like an arrangement that's normal in India. They do it some out in Tibet. I think the Hopi did it a bit. But in general, across the planet, you almost never have multiple men marrying a single woman, at least not until like the internet made it popular with like blue-haired chicks. Yeah. So the thing is like there's this sense of unnaturalness.
Well, is that in the story only, or is that also something that was happening in the culture that gave us the story?
Most likely wasn't happening in the culture. And in fact, nobody like it.
So then what is it symbolic?
I think, because this story represents the transition into the Kali Yuga. The story represents a transition into a degraded era. And so...
Is it kind of like the decadence of everyone trying to be the great king? Is that
that's part of it, but mainly it's just that it's just weird, right? Like it's something that's unnerving for any Indian man wants like a lot of wives. Mm-hmm. He definitely doesn't want his wife having God's babies, right? This is like, all of these are like unfortunate circumstances, but built...
Series of unfortunate events.
Yeah, but based on karma, right? Because this would have never happened had he not killed that deer. By the way, when the second lady has the child, or has the twins, he can't help himself, and he ends up like making off with her, and that's it for him.
Maybe you could say that the killing of the deer while it was fornicating was symbolic of denying nature its ability to create naturally.
I love it.
That leads to significant decadence in us.
I love it. Yeah.
But that was the butterfly effect, right? Because if that one little thing hadn't happened...
Yeah.
Right.
And there's a series, like, that's one of the things that's also really rich about the Mahabharata is that you see, if you really trace it out, you can find all these different karmic threads that cause each thing to happen, both the good and the bad. Yeah. And it's all woven into one whole, but you're still left with the problem that all Hindus and all Buddhists and all Jains were left with. What do you do about constant, eternal death and rebirth and death and rebirth and death and rebirth? And I mean, these guys, these 5 brothers, eventually, they're in line for the throne. The bad side, eventually they're born. Another 2 years goes by, and these artificial wombs basically begin to crack open. And when the first one emerges, Duryodhana, kind of like, did you ever see Gremlins? When they come out of the pods? It's sort of like that. Imagine that sound, like, and that's the way it's described in the text. In the text itself, it says that as soon as these babies are born, the jackals began braying, and the babies are born squalling like donkeys.
Wait, isn't a jackal like a half rabbit, half deer?
A jackal is like a dog. It's a canine, but it's a carrion. Or the way they thought of it is it eats only the dead. And the vultures began screaming. It's like all the carrion creatures began screaming. Huh?
Like baby. Are you referring to the babies?
The
eating
god
only the
babies.
dead?
All the god babies got born out of the jar.
Yeah, the god babies are being born out of the jars, kind of like the gremlins.
Been eating the dead?
No. But in response, just to give you an idea of like.
Like this is a live action.
See, you need to know. The writer of the Mahabharata, or the many writers as they're telling the story, need you to know that this is all bad news, right? And so all these omens, there are 3 eclipses, for instance, that are happening at this time.
Well, if it's
There's
an omen, why did they like protect it in a jar full of butter?
because they need to have the king. They want to have a king, and they're pretty sure they can knock off.
Like even if the king's like some gremlin.
Yeah, and
Most of them are.
yeah,
That's fair.
yeah. And so to fast forward to the battle itself, they do their best to knock off the rightful heirs of the throne, right? There's the dice game. They lure Yudhisthira, the king, or the would-be king, into playing dice and wagering everything that he owns, including his brothers, including himself, and last, his wife, their wife, Draupadi. Now, what's interesting, though, is, again, this is a culture where women in general are in the kitchen, right? But you have these strong female characters over and over again. In fact, you have a transgender a female who becomes a male knight. And then also, there's a whole saga where Arjuna, the warrior, dresses up like a woman to conceal his identity for years. And got guys hitting on him and all this other stuff. So there's every step of the way, the Kali Yuga is obvious. It's obvious that the moral order has been subverted. There's something off. Something's wrong. And again, no matter what, all this karma means everyone's going to be reborn. Everyone's stuck in their respective identities. They're exiled, okay? They get Draupadi back. Draupadi argues, rightfully so, that if the king had already become a slave and wagered himself away, then he couldn't rightfully wager her away because she was free and a slave can't wager a free person. So they just exile them 13 years. They come back, then here's the big fight. And this is literally the end of the world. This is going to usher in the Kali Yuga, but it is the end of the world. It's a civilization-destroying Atlantis-like event. And what's also really interesting in the Mahabharata is you have, in Hindu myths in general, is you have these technologies that resemble modern technologies. So you have the Vimana, a machine that flies around at the speed of wind. You have artificial wombs, as we just saw or heard. And you also had the Brahmastra. And the Brahmastra, remember Brahma, the god of creation? The Brahmastra is an arrow that will destroy everything around it. It will shatter, it will rumble the mountains until they crumble. It will boil the seas, and it will leave all the earth around it dead and unable to grow crops.
So like a nuke?
In essence, it's a nuclear warhead.
So they had UFOs, nuclear weapons, and
Artificial wombs.
genetic engineering.
And you don't say you believe in UFOs.
I didn't say I didn't. I'm just saying,
Earlier when I asked about the
I'm just saying that I'll reserve judgment until better evidence is presented.
They identified it. They said what it was.
Yeah, it's a Vimana. I believe in Vimanas, not necessarily Vimanas from Venus. But this is really interesting, and this is why, for instance, Oppenheimer taught himself Sanskrit and was obsessed with the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita. And of course, many people, like pretty much anyone from the modern era who read the Mahabharata and saw the Brahmastra was like, yes, clearly this is a nuclear weapon that they're talking about.
Did Darrow have evidence of nuclear catastrophe in the streets?
I don't know. I mean, there's stories told, but I don't know.
So why is Shiva doing a dance of destruction at CERN?
I don't know.
I got a question. So
Yes.
how much of this do you take as literal strings to go find these things versus phenotypes of stories for example, the baby in the little basket.
Yeah.
That sounds like Moses.
Yep.
Do they have a flood story? Do they have Gilgamesh type stuff?
This would be, in a sense, you could say that this was their flood story, but instead of a flood, it was just a world cataclysmic war,
Or an apocalypse.
an apocalypse.
We're seeing things that over and over again showing up. That's like, this sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Why does it sound so familiar?
Because it sounds like World War III, except for it's occurring in their minds. Again, these are like stories after stories after stories. These are happening thousands, millennia ago, actually, many millennia ago. If you look at the beginning of the Kali Yuga, they have ridiculously large time scales. Like bazillions of years for the early yugas. So, but this is in essence their kind of Atlantis story, because by the end of the war they have destroyed everybody, except for just a small few survivors. Who are the good guys obviously win.
So they can write the story.
And tell the story.
So the part about the nuclear,
Yeah.
the nuclear weapon, there's like a nuclear weapon.
Mhm.
It's kind of interesting because if you go to Egypt, there's like a pyramid that looks destroyed, like as if like it's been like eroded.
Yeah.
But if you look closely and really inspect the rocks, it looks like it's been blown up. And even more, if you reach your hand like feet into the sand, you can pull up glass balls.
Maybe it was the nukes from the Mahabharata.
Since when does sand
The
turn to
Brahmastra.
glass balls?
The Brahma, the arrow of Brahma. And they're obsessed with arrows and projectiles, almost as obsessed as they are with like weird forms of conception.
I have a couple of questions that you can
Yes, sir.
help me with.
Yes, sir.
In your studies, what is the more ancient writing, Sanskrit or cuneiform text?
Cuneiform is definitely the most ancient writing, but Sanskrit is probably, or the ancestor of Sanskrit is probably a more ancient language. But nobody really knows until you get the writing. But cuneiform is the first real written text. The Sanskrit, I don't remember the exact date it starts appearing. It's late, like before the Buddha, but definitely after the Iliad
So
and like linear B.
I think that's my understanding too, but I just wanted to make sure. So have you ever read any of the Zachariah Sitchin books, the Earth Chronicles?
Planet 9.
So, 12th Planet.
12th planet. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Forgive me.
well, I just think it's really fascinating. I've read them all, and I'm contributing in thought because you're pulling up a lot of stuff that's cross-referenceable. The argument that Sitchin makes is that cuneiform Mesopotamian, pre-Mesopotamian source writings are the origin stories for almost everything that's in the Bible, and are similar in more sort of Western traditions.
Yeah.
It's just revisited.
I mean, definitely the flood story.
Definitely the flood story. Definitely.
Was it Utnapishtim?
Yep.
So I'm real curious about that. We don't have to explore it, but
Well, I'll tell you what the Brahmins would say. They would be furious at the concept that their religion came from anywhere but India. Like, they get really, really assed up about this, like big time. Like this whole theory of the Indo-Europeans or the Aryans coming down and invading India and all that. They're like, this is a horrific, racist projection of European supremacy. Because obviously we are the supreme people, and all religions come from here, from India, from Mother India, and our noble blood is homegrown, and you are all descendants of us.
how were the Titans considered demigods? Were the Titans considered pre-human? Were they considered mixtures of gods and men?
No.
The Nephilim.
Yeah, no, so it's very interesting. It's very similar in India, by the way. The Indians also believed, so just as the Greeks had the Olympians and the Titans, right, the kind of good guys and the bad guys, or at least the winners and the losers, the Hindus had a similar concept that the Asuras, or the evil gods, or the bad gods anyway, were ascendant, and that the Devas, who, Dharma and Indra and so on and so forth, that they eventually dominated them and demoted them. So you have a similar sort of tale there. So no, I mean, basically they're very human-like, but like the Titans, the original Titans were like Kronos, Uranus, I believe, was considered a Titan. Yes. Gaia. But it begins with like, oh man, I'm gonna have to go back. And by the way, all these stories of the Titans and all that, they come down kind of later. They're written down, so nobody knows exactly how old they are. But basically, the Titans are considered to be gods that were just simply, they didn't have what it took to stay in power. And the Olympians overcame them. And there's all these stories in the ancient Greek, especially like Plato, but also, you have the story of Prometheus, and the gods feel threatened when he steals the fire to bring down to earth. There's
the son of a god and a human woman.
Yeah.
So he was a demigod.
Yeah. The Titans would have been more gods, but like loser gods.
Loser gods.
But you had this, but that idea like comes up over and over again among the Greeks. Like if the humans get a little too uppity, then they'll overtake the Olympians just like the Olympians overtook the Titans. And so they're always trying to keep us down, man.
Mm-hmm.
I just had an epiphany when you were talking about the Indian culture saying that we're the one true race and everyone descends from us.
Yeah.
That is all of the major religious cultures tend to believe that, and that's very reminiscent of this story of every one of these groups believing they have the one true king and it's the only one, and that leading to the decadence that none of us are coming to some sort of agreement and we're all ending up at odds with each other, leading to the Kali Yuga.
Yeah, as far as the Kali Yuga, the essence of the Golden Age was that it was very much like the Bible in the sense that people lived, bazillions of years. Everybody was nice. So the king, one of the really critical parts of the Golden Age, before the Silver Age and the Bronze, was that they had long lives, but the king lived to serve the people. So all the people were happy. He was still a king, and the king was also in direct alignment with the God's will. And then one of the defining points of like the Silver Age and then the Bronze Age and the Kali Yuga was that lifespan, it shortens. People's dharma is more and more corrupted, right? And their adherence to the gods. And the caste system begins to shift. Like there's this great passage from the Vishnu Purana that describes what the Kali Yuga, the true depths of the Kali Yuga will be like. And it's like the barbarians have come, right? The outsiders, the foreigners have come and encroached on our soil. The priests are just priests in name only. They do the chants, but they don't believe. The kings are plundering the people. The slaves are telling everybody what to do, so it's kind of like communism. The women are uppity. This is kind of like now. And this is like, so that's the two things is like the distance from the gods and the inversion of what they consider to be that natural order. But again, with like the Buddhists, though, I mean, the Buddhists believe, and each Buddhist sect believes, like they wouldn't be what they were if they didn't think they were right, and the other ones are mostly, maybe they're like partly right, but they all basically, I mean, I don't know of any religious tradition. Some are more chauvinistic than others, but I don't know of any religious tradition that doesn't ultimately say, like, we're right. Even like the most liberal religious traditions now, it's like, our tolerance is better than yours, And it's like, yeah. One of the things about the caste system is, the Indians are the most exacting. Like the Indian, and they called, each caste, the Indians called each one a varna, a color. And the whole color scheme of what they considered to be like the intellectual was white, the passionate is red, the indolent or the lazy or the slow is black. Like it's really kind of encoded across the Hindu culture, what we would call now racism, right? But what really distinguishes it is how elaborate and specific they were. So there's like all these specific jatis within the varnas, like these little subcastes. And by the way, a woman can marry up, but a man can marry, a woman can marry up, but a man can't marry up. A lot of the caste system is about keeping, a brother down, basically. But the idea of caste, like what we see as a caste system in India, totally elaborated again in Plato, in I cannot recall which dialogue. Maybe it's the Republic, but I believe it is the Republic. He describes something very, very similar: the warrior, the philosopher king, the warrior, and the slaves. And then, in China, you had something very similar. Really, the only difference is feudal Europe, right? Feudal Europe is very, very clear. This is the priest, this is the king, these are the lords and the vassals, and so on and so forth. And then these are the serfs. And America, even now, still America still has its own caste system. It's just more fluid and less specified. So that hierarchy, I think, is the only human cultures that were roughly egalitarian, at least that I know of. I mean, people, maybe it's wrong, but tribal societies, so far as the missionaries and anthropologists and colonists described them, and people discovered them like when they were still kind of virgin before they were corrupted, and given guns and horses and things like that. They were almost all, down to the last, egalitarian. And they enforced their equality by way of violence. So this is all described by a guy who wrote a book called Hierarchy in the Forest and also Moral Origins. His name will come later. But what he did is he codified and put it in a database all of these different cultures. Are they equal, are they not? And the way that they enforced the equality was, again, by murder. By extreme violence, shaming first, murder second. And they would usually, this is a very common thing to happen from Africa to Indians to so on and so forth. They would have their own family members murder them so that it wouldn't start a blood feud. Christopher Bohm. Now, maybe he's wrong, maybe not. But it's an interesting concept. After that, though, any agricultural civilization, you start to see the diversification into the division of labor. And it's very remarkable, going back to the conversation about eusocial insects, the termites, the ants, the bees, wasps. They also divide into something very, very similar in regard to hierarchy and role. It's as if there is a form in nature that a sufficiently large civilization requires.
It is colony.
Yeah.
Tribe, colony, survival of the reproduction, the queen. That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, and it's not to say it's ideal, is an ought, but it is. And then, even communism, communism is an attempt at equalizing it, but every communist society, you still have a hierarchy. They say it's equal. Yes, sir.
I have two questions.
Yes.
Again,
And I'll wrap up after this. I know that you guys have hung in here for a long time.
Yeah.
what's the song of the Lord, and also why are all the Indian and Hindu gods like elephants and like snakes and animals and like turtles with like cat faces for like tails? Just
Yeah.
like that.
Kind of like Egyptians, right?
Yeah.
And the Greeks.
Bunch of
They call it zoomorphism. It's means human-like beings with animal qualities, like crocodile heads and so on and so forth. The elephant head guy, I can tell you right now how he got his head. Shiva, you remember the god of destruction we were talking about before? Shiva he represents kind of the Kali Yuga, right? So Shiva is one of these sannyasins. Shiva, if you look at images of Shiva, he's always on a rug, he's naked, he's dirty, he's got dreadlocks, he's smoking dope, he's a blueser, right? But he's a magic loser. And he is always yeah. And he's always going out into the Himalayas, right? Like Shiva is always depicted as being out at the Himalayas, oftentimes at the head of the Ganges. So,
That's where ganja came from.
and so he comes home, and he's left his wife home pregnant. She has their baby, Ganesh, who would eventually become the elephant head, but he's just like a normal kid at this point. And she goes to take a bath and tells him to guard the door. And Shiva comes home from a long wander, and he's, ready to see his wife. And he's like, nope, halt. And he's like, I'm your dad, get out of my way. And he's like, nope, I don't care. You look like a loser, get out of here. And so he takes his blade and cuts the kid's head off and throws it, beyond the horizon. And, his wife, yeah. So his wife comes and, yeah.
Don't call me a loser, Trey.
Yeah. And his wife comes and finds the kid headless, and she freaks out. She's like, you never do anything. You're never here to do any work. You don't bring money home. You never do anything. And now you've killed our only kid. And he said, okay, don't worry. And he chops off an elephant's head, and he puts the elephant head on the kid's body, and boom, the god Ganesh is born.
How did he become a
Fixed
god?
it.
Well, he's the son of a god, and the two gods.
Wait, so is the guy that chopped the kid's head off the guy that
That is
that sat on a rug and smoked dope?
that's him.
That's horrible, though.
And he was a little bit violent. He was a little on the violent side. Yeah. You remember all the other stories of where all these guys came from. These Hindus had some wild ideas about where people came from. Now, something you got to remember too, though, right? Now, just if I leave you with any two ideas, I know we have gone all over the place. If I could leave you with two ideas, it is this. Number one, the Hindus, similar to Plato and a few other Greeks, and of course similar to Jews and Christians, believed, at least the most developed philosophies or later philosophies, believed there is one God. But unlike the Jews or Christians, they did not think that the other gods were fake. They thought the other gods were just lesser representations.
Like a rainbow.
Like a rainbow.
White light is one dot.
Perfect, yes.
And then you split it through the prism.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
And they also believed that God is in each one of us, right? So even if, you do have like a system in which the lower castes don't have, they're just basically slaves, and the kings are super privileged, they still believed that they were all one person, right? The Purusha. They all came from the same place, and ultimately would all go to the same place. So salvation might take a long time for some, but with, to the extent it was thought out, there was a sense that everyone had the potential to be saved, meaning that you would be off the wheel of birth and death and rebirth, and you just had to work at it. The Buddhists thought it'd be easy. Now, again, there was this big problem with the Buddhists, right? The Buddhists and the Hindus didn't get along so hot because the Buddhists were taking all of these princes like the Buddha away, and people were like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to go live with the Buddhists and get enlightenment. This is garbage. And they disrupted the society. And so the Hindus had to come up with something to draw people back to duty, back to dharma, back to the law. What was your duty as a priest, duty as a warrior, duty as a merchant, duty as a servant? Now, this is the scholarly interpretation. This is not how Hindus see it. Hindus do not believe this way. You asked, and I'll answer. This is the very last part, the only part, really. This whole thing was all just to get to the song of the Lord. And what is the song of the Lord, right? You got two armies arrayed against each other, good guys, bad guys. But even the bad guys are family, and the good guys know this. And so you've got Arjuna, the warrior.
Civil War?
So basically like the Civil War. It is a civil war. And so Arjuna, they're all getting ready to, this is a war too, by the way. They're talking about it up to this point. They're like, this is a war that will end civilization. It will end everything. And, we shouldn't.
Going through with it.
Exactly. And so Arjuna, the son or incarnation of the storm god, the warrior god, is starting to have second thoughts. And he's telling his chariot driver, this dark-skinned, lowly chariot driver, hey man, I'm going to get terrible karma for killing my kin, and this is just awful anyway. Some of these people are like, they're teachers, right? These are some were people they grew up with and played with. So he's telling his chariot driver, and this is the main theme of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is just one little section in which the war may go on and the world is ending or not. And Krishna, the chariot driver, the dark-skinned villager, the troublemaker, turns around to him and tells him, you need to understand, I'm not just some lowly villager. I am God. I am not just a god like you, just a lowly storm god. I'm the God, Vishnu, which is the face of the God, Brahman. I am the God. And, Arjuna's like, what? And he says, if you want, he's like, this is what you need to understand.
And so is he actually the God or just like acting like
This
he's
is
God to do what he wants?
so the charioteer turns to him and he says to him, you are a warrior, you are a king, you have to do your duty no matter what the karma is. Your duty is devotion to me, to God. He's like, Arjuna is obviously, the warrior, is a bit skeptical. And so he says, if you want, I'll show myself to you. And this is one of the most beautiful passages in all world religion. And that is the song of the Lord. He turns and he asks Arjuna, he shows himself to Arjuna, and he says to Arjuna, what do you see? And Arjuna is freaking out. You would think he had been eating soma. And he says, I see you as beginningless, middleless, and endless. I see you with 1,000 eyes and 1,000 mouths and 1,000 arms and 1,000 feet, meaning infinite arms. You are everything. I see your body stretched from one end of existence to the other. And most importantly,
Like what?
like a sausage.
Sausage dogs.
And most importantly, he could see the future in God. And what he saw was all of the armies that were arrayed against him being devoured in God's thousands of mouths, fangs dripping with blood, flame flicking out of his breath. And then he saw himself and his own family and all living creatures and everything disappearing into the mouth of God, who chewed up everything in creation. And he said, what you have to understand is this is not something to be afraid of, because inside of you is an eternal soul. And no matter what happens, no matter what you do here, no matter what happens to you here, that eternal soul will go on. And what you need to worry about isn't whether or not you're going to get blood on your hands or whether you're going to lose or whether you're going to win. What you need to worry about is the condition of that eternal soul. And so Arjuna is like, okay, what do I have to do? And Krishna says you have to do your duty. And if you do your duty without any other thought than that you are doing your duty as a dedication to me, then you will have heaven.
So the chariot driver opened up and like showed his true self, or was it
True self.
Oh, so the chariot driver really was like the God.
The God, the big God. And remember, he was a dark-skinned chariot driver, a villager. Mid-caste, but yeah, I mean, it's complicated, basically.
Not a Brahmin.
Basically, not a Brahmin.
Wouldn't they have known?
Huh?
Wouldn't everybody have known, like when he was born, like that he was a...
Well, there's stories, but
Reveal himself until that
but that was the big reveal. And so Arjuna does what you would expect him to do. He says, okay, let's do this. And the war commences, and it's just like, like I say, the Mahabharata is 15 times bigger in the Bible, and a big part of it, like a lot of it, is literally just this guy's getting chewed up by that guy, this guy's getting stomped. There's like all these onomatopoeias, because the ground is so full of blood, of like, feel all the blood on the ground, and they kill everybody. There's only just a few left. And in the very end, and this is, I think, one of the most interesting parts about the story, they kill everybody, they inherit their kingdom with the few remaining survivors. Thus begins the Kali Yuga, our age, the degraded age. And
The Lord is chaos.
the song of the Lord is do your duty with love for me. Now, this is also an answer. Duty is dharma. So unlike the Dharma of the Buddhists, unlike the Dharma of going off into the monastery, this is the Dharma, the salvific Dharma of being a warrior or being a slave or whatever it is you were born into and staying true to that. Then at the end, they live out their lives, and as would often happen in Hindu culture, it was time for them, they're in old age, they're going to go off into the wilderness. They're kings with one queen. They decide they're going to go up the mountain to the highest peak, and they're going to try to get into heaven before they die, basically. And so they're all marching up the mountain, and one by one, first the wife, then the 4 brothers, except for Yudhishthira, the king, they all die. But Yudhishthira is undaunted. He keeps going, and there's a dog trailing behind him and has followed him this entire way. And he finally gets to the gates of heaven, and there's Indra, the storm god, and he's the one guarding the gate to heaven. And he says, "You can come in. Here is your chariot to go into heaven." And he's like, "Okay," but the dog can't come. And he says, "Well, then if the dog can't come, I won't go." And the dog, you got to understand, the dog is more unclean than even the most unclean, low-caste person in the Hindu mind. And so Indra says, "Okay, fine. You have shown your loyalty. The greatest thing, the greatest duty of a king is to be kind to those who are loyal to him. And you were even kind to this lowly dog. You will both go to heaven." But when he gets to heaven, it's just all of the bad guys, the bad army.
They're all the ones that died.
Well, the other guys died on the trip up, right? Oh, okay. And his family, the good guys, the Pandavas, aren't there. And so Yudhishthira says, I would rather be in hell than live in heaven with these people. And so the god said, "Okay," and sends him to hell. And he goes into the darkness and the wailing, and he can hear the voices of his family, and they're all screaming in pain and torture. But he's like, it beats being in heaven with those assholes. And it was
Truly twisted shit.
and then it's as if the whole scene kind of cracks open, and he had proven himself twice to be loyal to his own. And suddenly the veil is lifted, and it turns out that he is, in fact, in heaven, because he is in the presence of those whom he loved, like those who were in his tribe.
It's like the third plot twist.
Yeah, and then basically it just kind of tapers off from there. Krishna dies just by accident. Somebody accidentally shoots him in the ankle, kind of like Achilles. So on and so forth. Before you know it, somebody's buying a gas station and doing all the coding. But that is, I appreciate you guys hanging in with me, and I hope I answered your questions. That is the Mahabharata. That is the Bhagavad Gita.